This is Bhaskar Chakravorti, Dean of Global Business at the Fletcher School. I'm also here with Daniel Law, who's the head of strategy at Worley, and Gaurav Dalmia, who's chairman of Dalmia Holdings. And so, Gaurav, questions for you about India. And specifically, let's take a journey in a time capsule and head out to India 2047. The country has aspirations to be a developed country by 2047. And my first question to you is, of course, many different elements of this complex landscape, this very complex nation need to come together for it to be a developed country. What are the most significant conditions in your mind that need to be true for India to be a developed country by then, or Viksit Bharat as people dream of in India?
Well, Bhaskar, first of all, thank you for having me. Many of us in India, myself included, we think that it's our birthright to be a developed country. It's ingrained in us because of our rich heritage and history. So if you go back into 1600, Angus Madison showed that India was, I think, 20-odd% of global GDP. Today it's 3%, okay? So there is a train of thought that we need to go back to that number, and we will go back to that number. So that's an emotional statement. But if you were to look at the numbers, and if you were to do the math of per capita GDP and the growth of that, as per the East Asia Institute, developed countries are somewhere between $12,000 to $15,000 income per capita. Okay, some people even define it at 25,000, but most people define it at about 12 to 15,000. If you look at Indian per capita GDP today and were to forecast that, I think by 2047, which is what this Viksit Bharat target is, we should be into $10,000 to $12,000 per capita. Okay, which is where China is today. And just for comparison, America is $76,000 today. So if we are at that number, we'll certainly fall into the developed nations category. Now, in order to get there is obviously not going to be automatic. In order to get a couple of days ago, I was at a talk by the economist Land Princhet that I think you've heard of him. He's been to India several times since the 90s, and he's quite an India expert. And he made a point that actually resonated with me. And he said that in India, or in all countries, growth is not an inherent feature. It's a condition. It's a condition which is dependent on circumstance, it's dependent on decisions that we make, and so on and so forth. And very often, decision makers in a country forget that. So I think people in India need to realize, decision makers, that during heady times such as today, we need to understand that growth is very contingent. It's not a given. Second, our basic growth equation of demographics, which is dependency ratio leading to lower dependency ratio leading to high savings, leading to high investment and therefore high growth. That formula is actually working very well, okay? And we need to continue that formula. We need to make sure that it continues in a good way. Our investment rate is almost as high as 30% of GDP, which is what is driving growth. The third issue is, and that's a personal view that I have, an anecdotal view, not really a statistical, that the more complex a system, the more cyclical it is. A simpler a system, it could be a secular trend. So for instance, a surgeon's life is quite complicated, but his career could be fairly secular in terms of a trend. A hospital chain's career or future may not be as secular as the surgeons within it, because a hospital business is far more complicated. A country by its very nature is even more complicated. And therefore, many trends that look like secular trends in the near term end up becoming cyclical trends in the long term. So we need to be careful about that. And I think that realization is there, within the decision makers. Fourth, I think the world growth rate needs to hold up as well if India needs to grow very fast, because there is a kind of delta within which we operate. Indian growth rate is about 250 to 300 basis points more than world growth rate. World growth rate is projected to be 3.1 this year. By the way, in the 2004-2005 period, when India was in very heady times, 8-9% growth, world growth was 5%. So in India, we often forget how linked we are to world growth rate. and that must hold as well. The most important thing that must hold for India to get to developed country status is we need to improve our productivity. And this is a catch-all. This will mean infrastructure, hard and soft. It will mean a court and legal system must play out well. It must mean that urban migration trends should continue productively. State capacity is a new thing that we are seeing is a constraint. It's been documented very well, so we have to attack state capacity. India needs to be a part of far more FTAs in global trade agreements, and so on and so forth. Now, if we do all that, I think India will surely be a developed country by 2047. Just look at last year. Last year, we added 100 billionaires, aided, of course, by the stock market bubble. So India added 100 billionaires. Market leaders in various businesses continue to grow at 20-25%. If you look at Asian market cap rankings, including Japan, most ratings are ex-Japan. But if you look at the ones with Japan, India had 6 companies in the top 30. Okay, most of the Asian countries are facing similar growth characteristics as India. But I think by 2047, if we continue this, we might get from 6 companies in the top 30 to maybe 8 or 10. Now, let me just point out to 2 cover stories in a magazine called India Today, which is a very popular weekly magazine here. The first one was in, I think, July of this year. It featured 280 first-time members of parliament. And it gave their background, their life stories, and so on. And when I read that, I thought we were in good hands. We really were in good hands in terms of the legislatures we were appointed. A second cover story in India Today was about 2 years ago, and it was the dynamism of small town India. And it featured 178 people, each of them having a net worth of more than $120 million, all coming from tier 2 towns. Okay, and $120 million was a cutoff because it's about 1,000 crores net worth. And believe it or not, the total net worth of that group that they profiled and the businesses that they profiled was $80 billion. So if you look at dynamism in India and where the future is, it's not in Mumbai or Delhi or Bangalore alone. It's deep within India. And I think that will hold.
Great. Thank you, Gaurav, for that very sweeping arc of assumptions, conditions, and kind of helping us think through what that reality of a developed or almost developed status 25 years from now might look like. And I think your arc, if I remember this correctly, sort of goes from a demographic, benefiting from the demographics of India and the working age population and the dependency ratio being, kind of heavily favoring the growth story of India, all the way back to demographics as you sort of come back to the urbanization, extending into the tier 2 cities and essentially spreading some of that, the top of the pyramid, making it a whole lot wider across the country. But also you noted the new faces in Parliament and to some extent reflecting a sense of, kind of new ideas and new forms of, institutional change. And of course, many, many other factors in between, which we'll have a chance to dig into. But as you look across this arc, Gaurav, which are the ones that you feel are most vulnerable in terms of the assumptions that we make between now and 2047? Where can things go wrong?
Like I said a few minutes ago, growth is not really a feature, okay? It's a condition, and we need to create those conditions. Now, India is a large and diverse country with its own contradictions. So we need to manage those contradictions. So Ruchir Sharma, who ran Global Emerging Markets in Morgan Stanley, recently wrote a book on what's wrong with capitalism. And he features 3 countries as case studies or examples that we could learn from. One is Taiwan, one is Switzerland, and one is Vietnam. Now, India needs to learn from each of these kinds of countries. Taiwan has a population of 23 million. By the way, Greater Mumbai has a population of 21 million. Okay. So we need to adapt and see how we might use best practices from a Taiwan or a Vietnam, which is 100 million in population, and so on. And I think the most critical variable that we need to address is productivity improvement, which actually means hundreds of small things. The demographic window can become a demographic curse if we don't do it right. So if you look at data from the Economic Survey of India itself, we need to add about 8 million jobs a year between today and 2036. And if we don't do that, it's going to create social problems. There are natural fault lines in India. So for instance, India's population density is 480 odd people per square kilometer, which is amongst the highest in the world. Compared it to Indonesia is 156, so Brazil is sub 100. So a lot of things that need not be zero-sum games in other countries become zero-sum games in India. Urban versus rural, industry versus forest, and so on and so forth. And we've got to delicately manage. A second fault line is, and I've pointed this out several times over the last 10, 15 years, is Western and Southern India are growing about 12% faster than Eastern and Northern India on average. And this is creating an economic divide between the West and South on one side and East and North on the other side. And that needs to be managed as well. Then there are linguistic fault lines, there are religious, and it requires deft management. We need to certainly put economy first if we need to get to it. One caveat I would say is, if you took a top-down analysis, people will say, oh, India has a huge middle class. I think World Bank will put that number at 400 million. But if you talk to Indian businesses, they would argue that the Indian middle class, from a true purchasing power and lifestyle filter, is actually a lot smaller. So, for instance, if you look at refrigerators, we are reaching that number. About 350 million homes have refrigerators. Okay. If you look at cars, we are nowhere near that. It's about 100 odd million. That's there. If you look at consumer niche consumer brands, the addressable market's actually very, very small. So we need to really expand our middle class if we need to reach Viksit Bharat. And I think one of the most important deliverables for a Viksit Bharat will be strong institutions. So if you look at what's going on with Indian institutions, is they very often have conflicting claims on them. They're a regulator, yet they control public sector companies, deliver services at a low price. They have to maximize government revenue. And these conflicting claims need to be managed well. It's not clear to me how governments will manage those. A second is, if you look at a crisis and a great solution to a crisis in India, very often it is a great individual, a great bureaucrat, a great police officer, a great politician standing out and solving a problem in the face of a mediocre institution. And we need to institutionalize that merit and not have individual merits carrying India forward. So I would say those are the two big things if we can do: manage our institutions, make them more productive, expand our middle class. I think we will get there, but it's easier said.
Great, thank you for that. So I think, of the many points that you mentioned, one point you did not mention, and quite often, is the first thing that strikes a visitor to India the moment they get out of the airport. And I'm curious about what you see the vulnerability of this particular subject might be. And this is a complicated one, so I'll permit me to do a little bit of a build-up. And it sort of ties into many of the issues that you talked about, whether it's productivity or some of the other factors, and particularly productivity. And this has to do with infrastructure. And of course, Indian infrastructure has gone through dramatic change in the last decade. There's been a lot of improvement on the physical front, whether it's roads and ports and highways. But as one thinks about the broader infrastructure that goes from the human infrastructure to the hard infrastructure to the digital infrastructure, and most significantly, the energy infrastructure, I'm curious about how you see that front developing as we look ahead, and do you sense some room for optimism there? Are there vulnerabilities? Are there issues we should be, red flags we should be looking out for? So I'm sorry, that is a very complicated question, and I've also framed infrastructure in a very broad way.
I agree infrastructure is a key determinant. If you look at where India was historically on the infrastructure curve, we were way behind other developing countries as well. I think we are catching up. So if you were in the 90s and you took a public poll, should government of India spend X number of dollars in infrastructure versus handouts? You would have got an overwhelming response, I think, that people would have preferred handouts over infrastructure because infrastructure was considered somewhat elitist. It was not necessarily going to help the common man that much and so on and so forth. In 30 years, that worldview has changed. Today, if you took that same poll, I think infrastructure will win hands down over handouts. And if you look at the numbers from the last couple of years, last 10 years actually, infrastructure spends have gone up. I would have said most people 10 years ago would have underestimated the systematic way in which the government of India has gone out and spent money on infrastructure. So I think that's been one of our great victories. So let me give you a statistic. About 3.5% of our GDP, which is about $132 billion, was spent on infrastructure last year. The pipeline is almost 10x. Last 5 years, CAGR, I'm told, is about 27. So the infrastructure business and the capacity creation there is going well. You know, from a common man's perspective, what he sees, rural electrification is now, railway electrification is now at, I think, 94%. There are 84 new airports in the last 10 years. So it's actually changing the contours of modern India. Soft infrastructure is trickier. So if you look at health infrastructure or school infrastructure, that's a different story for various reasons. One, it's a high-touch industry as compared to hard infrastructure. Secondly, a lot of that is what we in India call a state subject. So central government can't make a decision, and different states may make different decisions. And therefore, the outcomes in different states may be different. Plus, the lead times of effecting change over there is a lot more because of the soft nature. But net, those are changing as well. So our healthcare infrastructure has improved dramatically. Our education infrastructure is improving relative to what it was. And, I think it's happening. If you look at the upside from this, take agri as an example. 8% of global food wastage apparently happens in India, which is just atrocious. And with better road infrastructure, cold chain infrastructure, that is going to reduce and it will improve productivity of agriculture. If you look at tourism, which is one of the great employment generators around the world, and people underestimate the potential of tourism to create employment. If you compare India with Thailand, in the first 6 months of 2024 itself, Thailand had approximately 17 million arrivals. India, in all of 2023, had 9 million. So there's a huge potential for India to improve its tourism. By the way, Forbes ranked India as the 7th most beautiful country in the world. Indonesia was number 1, New Zealand was number 2. US, by the way, was number 12. India was number 7. So that's a latent potential. And as infrastructure improves, which means ability to get visas, which is soft infrastructure, hotel and road infrastructure, which is hard infrastructure, I think tourism will play out as well. And China Plus One is also an infrastructure play, according to. Thus far, China Plus One has not done very well in India. We are trailing what our own projections were. But if you look at Nomura's projections, these are long lead time things anyway. Our current export from 400 odd billion should go up to 800 billion by 2030, based on, swing of base from China, some to Vietnam, some to Indonesia, some to India. So I think everybody in India understands that. And infrastructure is a critical variable, which is already being played.
Great. So let me now drill down into a part of the infrastructure that we didn't get a chance to drill into, but I will, which is sort of coming back to the aspiration of 2047 to be a developed country. There's another parallel aspiration, which is by 2070 for India to be net zero. Now, if you think about the energy infrastructure and the energy needs that accompanies an India growing at 7.5 to 8.5% between now and 2047, those energy needs need to be fed, consistently. And of course, India has plenty of cheap coal, and that's kind of one pathway to go. But simultaneously, if we are looking for an energy transition towards more green forms of energy, how do you see the trade-off between maintaining that fast growth and feeding it with the energy it needs, and also switching over to green without necessarily going into a massive fiscal hole through government subsidies. How do you see that playing out, kind of managing that trade-off? And do you think that is possible, or do you think there's an internal conflict in these two big aspirations that the country has got?
After my personal view is, on the surface, this looks like a zero-sum game. Okay. Which means if you want to grow faster, the green transition will be slower, or vice versa. There is an aspect of tragedy of the commons which stares in our face. But I subscribe to Bill Gates's point of view, which says the green transition will happen when it's commercially viable. And it's going to be commercially viable faster than we think. So let me just take two examples. One is just adoption of LED lights. People adopt LED lights not because they are more green, just because they are cheaper, they have a longer life, they're better for the household. So in India's transition to LED lighting has been quite extraordinary. If you look at China and look at electric scooters and the penetration of electric scooters, that was driven by regulation, where there were dedicated lanes for electric scooters, electric two-wheelers, there were subsidies and so on. And that's triggered, which has now become self-perpetuating even as subsidies are getting removed and so on and so forth. So I think between commercialization, some triggers from the government, this green transition will happen quicker than we think. I was talking to a man called Hisham Mundol, who runs the India office of an organization called EDF. EDF, I don't know if you know the name, Bhaskar, is a US organization which focuses on climate change. It's one of the world leaders in catalyzing climate change. It was started in
Environmental Defense Fund.
Environmental Defense Fund, exactly. Yeah. We are supporters of EDF in India. And I was talking to Hisham Mundol, and we were talking about how cement industry in India, my family's in the cement business in India, is amongst the greenest in the world. Now, part of it is because of favorable circumstances. Part of it is because of efforts of the industry. India has more newer plants than many other parts of the world because it's still a growth market in India. In Europe, it's a mature business, so the plants are older and therefore less efficient on energy. Indian plants are 1/4 more energy efficient on average than the rest of the world. So it's already happening. These are commercial decisions being made by participants in this sector. If you take another example, okay, the 14th largest city in India is a city called Indore. And Hisham gave me some statistics about Indore. People in Indore take pride in the fact that it's the cleanest city in India. It's consistently ranked as the cleanest city in India. It now has Asia's largest bio-CNG plant to convert food waste into energy for bus operators. 90% of the homes in Indore, in the city of Indore, segregate waste at source. So they'll take out the high caloric value waste so it can be used. Now, these trends, if they've caught on in Indore, they'll catch on in other urban centers as well. And therefore, they will aid the green transition, whether at an industry level, such as the cement example I just gave you, whether it is a household level, as the Indore example. And I think I want to make one more point. A lot of transition for industrial businesses towards green will happen from machinery suppliers. And they will calibrate their equipment for the best standards in the world. So for example, if European standards become higher, more and more machinery suppliers will cater to European standards. And lower standard machinery will simply not be available. And therefore, countries like India or Indonesia and companies there will have to buy equipment and machinery which will cater to European standards. Just like today, if you wanted a cell phone without a camera, you just can't buy it. You have to buy a cell phone with a camera. Similarly, I think industrial equipment will be more green by its very nature because of regulations in other parts of the world, and developing countries will simply adapt to that. So because of all this, I don't think it's as much of a zero-sum game as it looks in the near term.
Interesting. I'd be curious to kind of dig into the energy efficiency of the cement business more deeply, and perhaps in a different conversation, because given the history of the Dalmias and cement, I'd love to kind of learn more about the energy efficiency, the origins of that, because I'm sure there's a lot of learning, more broadly on that. Coming back to the zero-sum aspect, you commented that the South and the West is doing better than the North and the East. And North, of course, there are some outliers like India, like Delhi and Haryana are kind of doing well. But generally, your framing makes sense. And I'm wondering whether there is another trade-off, which is there a part of India that is on the faster track, and another part of India that would necessarily be, not necessarily falling behind, but on a much slower track. And that part of India is also more coal dependent, for instance. That's also has a much larger part of the population that is in informal, low productivity, possibly, high proportion in agriculture, so is that part of is there a zero-sum aspect there? And I'm wondering whether there is a political constraint that prevents one part of India to race ahead without necessarily tending to the concerns and needs of the other part. And here I've really divided it by region, but also one can divide it by socioeconomic class. So there is a very large portion of India that is still, not necessarily living on less than $2 a day, but, pretty close to what could be considered, sub-poverty levels.
I do believe adoption rates for green technologies, for example, will be different within different parts of India, between different economic sections of people, and so on and so forth. And that's a given. But I believe you take any segment, it'll be faster than what the world believes it will be because of commercialization, and people will make decisions in their self-interest. People in Indore are not doing it to benefit climate change. They're doing it because their life is better. And this is Indore as a city as a whole. So you may have a similar dynamic in a poor state like Bihar, in a Patna, in the capital of Bihar, and so on. So I would say different people will respond differently. If you look at Rajasthan, which is semi-arid, and investments that are going into water conservation through check dams and so on and so forth, local communities are really stepping up to create these check dams for water conservation and for year-long water and so on and so forth. So I think local communities are far more dynamic than we think. Once they're given the tools, they will actually make it happen.
Okay. So I'm going to go to my next question from local to a more global issue, but I also I'm wondering, Daniel, do you have a time constraint? Because I do want to give you a chance to ask some questions that might be on your mind.
No, thanks, Bhaskar. Not at all. I'm happy to go till for another 25 minutes before my next appointment.
Okay, great. I really appreciate the extra time that both of you have given. This is such a fascinating conversation. I think we could go on for a couple more hours, but I will be respectful of the time here. So going from local to global, Gaurav, my question is now sort of going outside the borders of India. And it's an understatement to say that we are living in difficult times geopolitically. There are almost unresolvable conflicts and crises popping up everywhere. And of course, some of them are further away from where India is, but in India's neighborhood itself, there is trouble. There's trouble in Bangladesh. There's been, kind of ongoing challenges in Pakistan. There is, some quasi-stability in Sri Lanka. We don't know how long that'll last. And of course, north of the Himalayas, there's China. And, further away, there is Myanmar and all the other issues that lie just one step further in whether we're talking about Afghanistan, Iran on one side, to, changes going on in the Far East, and the challenges in the oceans, whether it's the Indian Ocean or the South China Sea. So a lot of potential sources of geopolitical instability. And I'm curious about how you see that playing a role in everything that we talked about, and particularly India's internal aspirations for development and fast growth.
So I do believe geopolitics will be a very important criteria. So if you look at the global risks that India faces today, well, world growth, as I was mentioning, is one of them. If world growth slows down, because of higher oil prices or geopolitical conflict or whatever, it'll hurt India. There is this trend towards protectionism. So the pendulum is swinging from free markets to nearshoring to this, that, and the other. And it's going to affect global trade, it's going to affect developing countries like India. And historically, India has not been a part of as many FTAs as we would have liked. So India is going to have to play catch up. Third, there's a lot of short-term thinking in politics because of the nature of politics and the nature of the election cycles around the world. And I came across a term called Confucianism, not to be confused with Confucianism. Confucianism comes from confusion. And there was an article by political analyst Stephen Walt in Foreign Policy, I think in 2012, which said that state decisions are guided often by ignorance and stupidity, not by fear or greed or idealism or vested interest or anything like that. So I think there'll be a lot of Confucianism as the geopolitical temperature goes up around the world, including India's decisions. And we'll have to live with it. Fortunately for us, India is on a sweet spot economically and politically. So if you look at economic slowdowns, India's banking balance sheet, corporate balance sheet, India's government balance sheet, India's foreign currency reserves, they are fairly strong. So we can go into a slowdown reasonably strong without getting hijacked by too much. Politically, if you were to look at India, India is considered a factor in the West that we can offset China. So India will be handled by, I assume India will be handled with kid gloves by the Western world. So given that we are on the political and economic sweet spot, I think it's now up to India to manage our own trajectory, with the circumstances that are there.
Any thoughts on China in particular? What needs to happen to China in the next 25 years for the growth aspirations for India? Does it play a big role in India's own journey?
Of course. If China slows down, just take an example. If China slows down, the world steel industry gets affected, India gets it. So to say that China won't affect India just won't work. I think it will, in industry after industry. I think China will focus on reviving its consumer demand as it's doing. And I think we should not write off China. China is going to revive. It may not go as to its heady growth days, but it'll go to decent growth. And I think the bigger worry out of China will be the geopolitical actions it takes. What happens with Taiwan and the constant fear that may be there? What happens on the India-China border, and so on and so forth. And, the scenarios out there, we'll have to just see how it plays out. So China is both a friend, I think, economically, and a risk geopolitically for India.
So let me ask my final question, Gaurav, and see if Daniel has other questions that I didn't cover. Many of these aspirational growth scenarios, of course, underneath them is a tremendous opportunity for growth in various industry sectors. And India has a rich tradition of Indian industry kind of rising to the challenge. But the growth we are talking about is quite spectacular. And that is going to extend the capacity of a lot of Indian industry, whether it is the big industry houses or the bottom-up entrepreneurs. And we see plenty of that, across the country. I'm curious about how you see the role of global companies participating in India's growth, particularly as one thinks about the energy infrastructure, the chemicals infrastructure, some of the other hard infrastructure. What's the role of the global corporations?
Well, I think global companies are in India. They're coming into India. They've had a good experience in India. So, for example, a couple of days ago, there was an interview with the CEO of Danone, the French food company, and they are increasing their investments in India. And one of the comments he made was, India is at the heart of what we do. So India, which means is very important to what it's doing. If you look at numbers coming out of Netflix, at a margin, an extraordinary portion of their incremental growth is coming out of India. So no matter which company you are, India is an important part of your strategy today, which 10 years ago was less so. Hyundai, by the way, has been immensely successful in India. And they're now trying to capitalize on the Indian stock markets by listing their Indian subsidiary in India. So they'll become like a local player, local shareholders, local management, global technology, and Indian market. And they're also using now India as a base to export to around the world. So the linkages between the Hyundais of the world and India are only increasing. So I think that's a sweet spot for global companies. India is a sweet spot. I'll give you another example. A distant relative of mine started a company called Bharat Semi. Bharat Semi is a semiconductor design company, and now they're going to manufacturing as well. Recently, Indian Prime Minister was in the US, and India signed an agreement where Bharat Semi, which is a bootstrapped, self-funded company by two entrepreneurs, okay, no venture capital, no outside capital so far. And the US Space Force is putting money. They're getting business from US businesses, US semiconductor companies. And they're going to be one of the forces out of Asia in the semiconductor space. It's a company called Bharat Semi, 5 years old. So there's a lot of linkage, even in sectors where you may not think it'll be that easy, such as semiconductors. So it's happening.
And just as a follow-on to that question, as you think about those linkages between international companies and Indian companies and the Indian market, are there some common mistakes that were made in the past that you think companies should be looking out for and not make as you look ahead? And what are some of the ways in which, the ones that were really successful, what are a few things that they did really well? And I'm talking about the international companies here.
Yeah. Well, I think companies that have been successful in India and those who feel disappointed they haven't reached their potential vis-a-vis the Indian market is people who take a top-down view of India often get seduced because the top-down view of India is actually very seductive. And when they come and do business in India, you find that it's not as easy. If you take a bottoms-up view of India and saying, okay, the top-down view is there, it's a given, let's put it in the background. And let's focus on what does it take to succeed, whether I'm a Coca-Cola or a Hyundai or a semiconductor company or an intermediate chemical business. I think those companies succeed. People who have local talent, who've built local talent. So Citibank is legendary now that they use Indian talent across the world. So if you go to Indonesia and Citibank, you'll find some guy from India who started his life at Citibank in India. So people who have these deep roots in India and deep management teams now have built that, actually doing very, very well. People who've come in with a more tentative view, just seduced by the top-down view, have had negative surprises and they're learning and they'll adapt and they adapt. So I think overall, if you see, international experience in India has been actually very good. By the way, Indian return on equity, I should point out, is amongst the highest in the world. Mm-hmm. So return on equity in India right now is 16%, which is, I think, the second highest in the world. America may be at 19 today, but America is at a historic high. India's historic high return on equity is 22%. Right now, we're at 16%, but it's better than all other countries except America right now. So international companies face good returns when they actually crack in.
Fantastic. Let me pause on that note because it's a good note to pause on. Any questions, Gaurav, that I should have asked but didn't? And of course, Daniel may have some questions that I didn't ask. So maybe I'll let Daniel pipe in.
Yeah, thanks, Bhaskar. That last couple of questions literally came from the proverbial notebook. It looks like you had eyes on me, but maybe just an extension on that, Gaurav. Any thoughts on how both private and public institutions need to work stronger together? I think India is particularly unique. You've touched on the fact that some regulators, obviously there are PSUs involved, and then with many of the private companies as well, many of them are kind of family-based conglomerates. What are the dynamics there, and how should we think about the intersection between those two?
If you look at Indian public institutions, they are far more open today in connecting with private institutions. So if you look at, I'm just taking a hypothetical example, AI regulation. Indian regulators are far more open to taking views from technology companies, consumer fora, and so on and so forth, as they form these regulations, as compared to what the same types of regulators were 20 years ago. So in that sense, it's much easier dealing with Indian public institutions today So, one should not feel shy of talking to them and approaching them and so on and so forth. Industry bodies find it that Indian industry bodies, whether it's an auto sector or chemical sector or pharmaceutical sector or IT services, they find Indian government very receptive.
Right. And Bhaskar, maybe the follow-up, well, what else should we be thinking about that we haven't talked about today?
What do you think, Gaurav?
Well, I want to make one kind of concluding point, if I may, which is a bit rhetorical. So there are a lot of transitions and changes that happen, which you can't forecast on day one. Okay. So for example, if you take the Indian IT services industry, which started in the 80s and today has reached $200 billion of IT exports from India. Started as a mom and pop cottage industry. Or if you look at digital payments and how quickly it's moved up. India leads the world in digital payments and so on. So a lot of these look like magic, 10 years down, 20 years down. And we have to understand, and I'll quote David Ben-Gurion, who was Prime Minister of Israel. I know Israel is not the favorite country in the world for many people today, but I'll quote him. And he said, in order to be a realist in Israel, and now I would argue same for India, you must believe in miracles. Because these miracles, whether it's digital adoption or creation of new industries, is happening in India. It's happening in many developing countries. So you've got to be able to believe in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think definitely one needs to believe in miracles to imagine, some of these transformational elements that we have been talking about. And Gaurav, you're kind of walking us through the many ways in which we make that journey has been enormously helpful. And of course, given your presence there in India for a long time, you are extremely youthful on screen, but we know your chronological presence in Indian industry has been there for a while, and so you have a lot of pattern recognition to reflect in your comments. We didn't touch a whole lot on the IT industry and digital payments, and that may also be a topic for another conversation as one looks at a different miracle that is on the horizon, and that has to do with new technologies, whether it's artificial intelligence or others. And there are a lot of questions as to whether the IT industry itself might be, quite vulnerable to AI, potentially displacing the Indian workers in this area. And maybe AI opens new doors. I mean, that's where there is a debate to be had, that India is a source of AI. There's a lot of AI talent in India. There's a lot of chip design talent in India. There is a semiconductor fab that is potentially, India may not be a big producer of chips, but at least it can participate in that industry. So there is on the technology front, there are a lot of interesting and exciting developments. You mentioned digital payments, and one wonders whether the foundation of that, the digital public infrastructure itself, might be a foundation for a very large spread of this mom and pop industry, across the country, which raises the productivity of both businesses and consumers. So lots of issues to explore as we go in that direction. But I think we should park this conversation here, unless either of you have anything more to add. But I'm enormously grateful to you, Gaurav, for, as always, you've been a friend and thought partner on these questions for a while. So I really appreciate your taking the time to chat with us.
Bhaskar, thank you.
Yes, likewise, Gaurav. I found the session and the 1 hour gone by very, very quickly, fiercely taking notes, really good insights, especially for someone who has a leadership position in a multinational company. I think this has been really beneficial, and it's great to hear it from, frankly, an investment perspective too, someone from the business side, because at times we hear a lot from the development side, and it's great to hear the conviction too that you've had.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your time.
Appreciate it. And thanks, Bhaskar, for organizing